Hi everyone, welcome back to Bodhi Tree Buddhism. We've got another class for you on this lovely Sunday morning, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. In particular, I had someone message me late last night, UK time, just to say thank you for putting up the classes, so thank you very much to that person. They'll just remain anonymous for now. For that encouragement, and I hope that if anyone else is benefiting from these classes, you can leave a message either just in the post on Facebook, or if you're watching them via YouTube, you can just throw them in the comments there as well. So where are we up to today? I think last week I mentioned that the numbering got a bit out of sync, so I think today we're up to class 11, and I hope that the post reflects that. And we are finishing off this section on hearing the Dharma to enter the path. And the content for today is actually really important. It's talking about what's known as the 5 vehicles and the 3 basic motivations. And I've mentioned this right at the start, I think back in class 1. And it's kind of a bit interesting that the text kind of takes up until this point to sort of flesh out the details of those. But you can kind of see why it does this, because these motivations and the 5 vehicles really only start after we have refuge and we have hearing the Dharma. So refuge is sort of like the real baseline for Buddhist practice, to sort of self-identify as a Buddhist, taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. And then of course we've got to have some contact with the Dharma, either via a living teacher or reading or watching clips online or whatever, through whatever means, and it's only then that we can start to talk about the basic core practices. So it's kind of a bit of a slow build up, and I think that the book's a bit like that. Maybe some people like to get into the juicy stuff and the exciting, profound stuff really soon, but actually this is one of the things I like about this book, the Way to Buddhahood, is that it's a slow build up. But it sets a really good, strong foundation. And ultimately, when I see people having difficulties with their practice, most of the time, they're having difficulties with some particular aspect of their practice, having difficulty with meditation, or they're having a difficulty with understanding some particular more subtle point of Buddhist thought. And usually, it's not actually that part that's the problem, it's the foundation isn't strong enough. And so to have this good foundation is really important. Okay, having said this, let's jump on into our text. Where are we up to today? Okay, so we can see here that we've got this new subsection of part 2, the goal and the 3 motivations. So we're going to talk about 3 motivations, but 5 vehicles. Okay, so these are the 2 parts that make up today. Got a bit of material, so I'll have to go fairly quickly. Let's see how it goes. So first of all, we have number 25, 闻法而发心，随机成差别. Hearing the Dharma and subsequently aspiring the mind. Let's just say aspiring. Oh, doesn't want to edit. Distinctions are made according to one's motivation. Okay, so we've been talking about hearing the Dharma, listening to the Dharma, finding a good teacher, or if it's not in person, through whatever means it is that we come in contact with the Dharma and we hear these teachings. Then, so subsequently, one has some kind of aspiration. Let's just rephrase this here. Sorry, the class has partly become a live translation session. Aspiration. Okay, now this term aspiration in Chinese, it's this expression here up in line 1, 发心. Now usually the term 发心 is a shortened version of the phrase 发菩提心, which is literally 发 means to kind of put out or start something. Puti is body, right? So like body is like Buddha, Xin is the mind. So sometimes in the broader sense it gets, initiate the Bodhi mind. Some of these translations I really don't like. The key thing here is that the term mind is actually almost like a verbal sense. It means what one intends, or what one's goal is, what one aspires for. So personally, I just prefer this idea of aspire or aspiration, and it includes the sort of the movement, the action of fa, but aspire, right, from the, comes from the same root as like spirit. It's like the soul, the internal parts of us. Now I know Buddhism doesn't talk about an eternal soul. Yeah. We all know that. But the key thing is it's something internal to us. It's this kind of the deeper part of our inner lives. So I like the term aspiration because it includes both this idea of moving towards something, which is like the fa, and also it's an internal, deep motivating kind of idea, what our aspirations are. So we hear the Dharma, and then when we hear the different teaching of the Dharma, then we think, well, okay, what I want to attain is such and such. Hence, part 2, distinctions are made according to one's motivation. So these are then distinctions in aspirations, which are based upon distinctions in one's motivation. What do you want to do? What do you want to actually achieve out of your Dharma practice? And that is a very important question. Sometimes, every now and then, I encounter something like you're starting up some new project or something, or some new, I get it for myself particularly, we're starting some like event. We're going to have some event, we're going to have some summer program, some particular project, something like that. And when we're setting it up and we're starting to do all the sort of nitty gritty administrative things, or what do we need to do, I always find the most important thing we need to do is say, what do we want to achieve with this? What are we trying to do? Sometimes we just find ourselves going through the motions of doing something. It's like we're doing it to do something. And if we forget why we're doing it, then sometimes we really just get kind of like in the motion, just going through the motions. But if we think carefully, what are we trying to achieve? We've got to make sure that then all our actions work towards that goal. Everything in that sense should start with a clear outline of what our motivations are. Okay, 3 basic categories. This brings us into verse number 26. 下求增上生，现乐后一乐，中发处理心，涅槃解脱乐，最上菩提心，悲智究竟乐。To scroll up a bit here. Those of lower motivation seek higher rebirth, happiness in the present and also happiness in the future. Those of middling motivation aspire to renunciation, the happiness of nirvanic liberation. Those of the highest motivation aspire to bodhi, the ultimate happiness of compassion and gnosis. Okay, so the first basic categorization, 3 main types, and they're called lower, middling, and highest. Though, to be perfectly honest, these are from a very Buddhist-y perspective of lower, middling, and highest. If we take it in terms of motivation for the majority of people out there in just the world and in society, even this lower motivation is actually quite a high sort of a motivation. So let's just talk about first the so-called lower motivation, and don't be put off by this term lower. Some texts will talk about this with respect to sort of like, I want to attain full Buddhahood, and say, this first lower motivation is kind of like inferior. But I think you have to be a bit careful about this. And sometimes what happens is people who are particularly in the Mahayana track, but you get it also for people who are not just also seeking liberation from the samsara, can also be kind of somewhat condescending to people with so-called lower motivations. So do be careful about this, and do sort of reflect upon the fact that these motivations are for us to reflect on. Remember that just like a week or 2 ago we had the verse, the Dharma is a mirror to reflect upon our own actions. It's not a scale to measure other people or to judge other people by. This is like a really critical point to practice. You've got to have what I call double standards, but I mean double standards in like a good way. The standards you use to assess your own practice and the standards you use to assess others, and most of the time we shouldn't really be assessing others' practice at all, need to be 2 different things. You can be quite demanding upon yourself, is usually pretty good for most people, but sometimes some people that isn't necessarily a good thing and they demand too much of themselves. But then putting expectations on others is quite a different thing. And we need to then have that kind of compassion, we need to have wisdom. Otherwise, what tends to happen is we end up being big fat hypocrites. We sort of claim that we have these high goals, but then we come up with all sorts of excuses for ourselves, but we use those same goals to then measure other people, criticize other people, and say how they're not practicing correctly. So I'm saying this right at the start. This is to assess our own motivation for our own practice, not to assess others, unless someone has specifically asked you to be their teacher. In general, like, keep our sticky noses out of other people's business is a good general principle, shall we say. Okay, so where were we? So this so-called lower motivation is higher rebirth, and what this means here is rebirth. So it's to be a human or a deva, a god, is the basic definition. And that means not just happiness in the present lifetime. So we want to be happy now, right? I mean, we want to be happy in this life. There's no sense in sort of like moving all happiness into the future. I'm going to be happy in the future, but I'm going to suffer now. Yeah, it's not quite like the marshmallow test with the kid. Don't eat the marshmallow now, but if you wait, you can have 2 marshmallows later. Yeah, okay. But these are not like the only options. It might even be possible to be happy now, have a marshmallow now, and have 2 marshmallows later. You gotta use your wisdom here. But not just in this life, also in future lifetimes. So if that's the goal, if the goal is simply to say, well, I just want to be happy in this life, but I also want to make sure that my happiness in this life doesn't lead to something really bad in my next life. In other words, happiness is derived from stealing from others, for example, and happiness at other people's expense. Of course, that's not really like valid. It's just not legit, is it? It doesn't work. We're not going to sacrifice long-term happiness just for a bit of happiness in the short term. And so what does it mean then for a Buddhist to say, well, I want to have a comfortable life as a human, and in my future lives I either want to also be not just any old human, but a human in good conditions. I want to have resources, and I need my food, my accommodation, my shelter. I also need other time in order to pursue other forms of happiness and to pursue my Dharma practice. Or the same thing in a higher form, a form beyond the humans in the divine realm. But that also needs to be sustainable. Okay, that's one of the key things here. It needs to be sustainable, whether it's happiness in the present or in the future. And that is called lower motivation. The reason why it's lower is it's still samsaric, right, from Buddhist perspectives. It's non-liberating, and we still have to acknowledge that ultimately there's no sort of like enduring sustainability in this. It's always at risk that things could go a little bit off course and we might lose that. We might even lose a human rebirth, okay, which is a big problem for long-term Dharma practice. So this brings us then to the second motivation, the so-called middling motivation. It's kind of weird in English. We've got lower, higher. What do you call the one in the middle? It's medium, middling? I don't know. I'll put middling. Middling motivation is aspiring to renunciation. And this, renunciation we usually associate with like monastic lifestyle. So yeah, kind of. But here it's renunciation of samsara. In other words, liberation, getting out of this whole cycle of rebirth. And therefore, the goal is not just happiness in the sense of like, I have wealth and I have family and friends and I have these types of happiness, but the happiness of liberation, end of afflictions. So this is called a middling motivation that seeks liberation for oneself. Now you can kind of see at this point why I say kind of the lower, middling and higher are kind of very relative terms. For most people, if you are out there, like your day-to-day motivation in life is, I am going to seek liberation from psychic existence. To be honest, the kind of lifestyle you'd live would be to most people like, whoa, this person is a really super hardcore Dharma practitioner. We would not consider that middling at all. We would consider that quite an extraordinary person, incredibly dedicated and, energetic person with regards to this goal. So, relative terms. But we still have then the so-called highest aspiration, which is to aspire to bodhi. So this is like the puti sin and bodhicitta, the aspiration to awakening. And now the term bodhi, strictly speaking, does also refer to the liberation in the middling motivation category, the liberation of the arahats and the pratchika Buddhas, the worthy ones and the solitary Buddhas. But usually, and here it means specifically the awakening of the Buddhas. So the full, complete and perfect awakening. Anuttara Sanyak Sambodhi is the technical term. And what does that compose of? It is comprised of the ultimate happiness of compassion and gnosis. So the gnosis is just a fancy word for like knowledge, deep wisdom and understanding that we need to be liberated in the first place. But there are also other forms. Just to be liberated in that middling category, to be an arahant or a pratchika Buddha, you need wisdom. How much wisdom do you need? You need enough wisdom to get rid of your afflictions. And to be honest, no more. Any more is just kind of like, it's like superfluous. It's like, if you're putting more effort, if you just want to be liberated, that's the goal, and you're putting more effort to attain more than that, it's kind of just like slowing you down. But to be a Buddha, you don't just need wisdom to free yourself from afflictions, you also need to have enough insight to be able to teach others and instruct others, and that's actually quite a different category, you know. And I think I've mentioned this before. There's a big difference between being a practitioner for yourself and being a teacher for others. For yourself, you just have to work on what works for you, what's sufficient for you. But when we want to be a teacher for others, we also need to know lots of things that might not be helpful for us, but are helpful for others. So it's actually, you have to know a lot more material. You have to know a lot of other things that you don't need, but others do. And why would you want to do that? That's when we have this element of compassion. So the two big aspects of being a fully awakened Buddha are wisdom for oneself and for others, and that wisdom for others through compassion. So, 3 motivations here, everyone. Lower motivation, which means I want to be happy in this life, and I want to be happy in my next life, and many lives to come. And that means basically I have to either be a well-positioned human being, I mean this is sort of dharmically speaking, well-positioned, or even a higher form of rebirth. Or the middling motivation, where like, well, I can see any kind of happiness as a human or a god in this constant cycle of rebirth and death is really not ultimate, and I want to free myself from the cycle. Then I'm seeking the happiness of nirvanic liberation. I'm going to renounce the world. Or we can see, well, it's not just me that needs to get out of this cycle. Others also are suffering as well, and I need to do what I can to free them. Therefore, I aspire to becoming a fully awakened Buddha who not only liberates myself, but is also able to liberate others and lead others to this goal. Then I need not just wisdom, gnosis, but also compassion. Okay, 3 motivations. Now, we haven't quite got to the 5 vehicles, but we're going to tie these through in a second. Well, actually, I think we've already mentioned them, haven't we? What other than the 5? So, the lower motivation has 2 vehicles. So, the lower motivation has 2 vehicles, which is to say, the human vehicle or the divine vehicle. So, these two motivations for happiness within samsara. Then, for renunciation, we've got 2 types as well. We've got the happiness of the nirvana, the liberation of an arahant. Sorry, I'm going back in my... Listen again. Humans, gods, arahats, liberated from psychic existence. And that 4th one there is the liberation of the so-called solitary Buddhas, right? The pratchika Buddhas. And then last but not least, we have the higher motivation, which is the motivation of the Buddhas, right? So, humans, happiness in this and future lives. Gods, happiness in this and future lives. Arahants, liberation from all forms of cyclic existence. Pratchika Buddhas, solitary Buddhas, liberation from all sorts of cyclic existence and passion and wisdom. Okay, let's move on now to our next verse. which talks a little bit about the relationship between them. So verse 27 here. 以下能其上，以上能摄下，随机无三一，归即为一大。The higher can be achieved in dependence on the lower. The lower are included within the higher. According to motivation, there are differences in the 5 and 3 vehicles, which ultimately return to the one great vehicle. So, the key bit here with this first line, the higher can be achieved in dependence on the lower, is in a way to correct an issue that we often see in Mahayana practitioners. People go, well, I want to be a fully awakened Buddha. And because my goal is to become a fully awakened Buddha, I don't need any of that other stuff. I don't need stuff for the human vehicle or the divine vehicle because I'm not trying to be reborn within samsara. I don't need stuff for the vehicle of the arhats or the Prajika Buddhas because that's not my goal. Therefore, I don't need any of the stuff. All their scriptures, all their teachings, all their practices. Now that is a big, big problem. And this is a problem that has in some ways at times plagued at least East Asian Buddhism. And I've also seen it elsewhere too with practitioners in the West who want to practice the Mahayana. Now, I mean, that's a great goal, to have that goal of wanting to be a fully awakened Buddha out of compassion for the benefit of others is amazing. But do not therefore think that all that other stuff you don't need. That is your foundation. I mean, think about it. You say, well, I want to be a fully awakened Buddha, but I don't actually want to do the things that would lead to a good human rebirth. Like, how are you going to... It's like, I want to be professor at the university, but I don't want to take an undergrad degree. I don't even want to take, I want to be professor of philosophy, but I'm not going to take Logic 101 at university. Like, how are you going to manage this? Don't think you're so badass that you don't need that stuff. Like, we totally need it. Yeah, I'm just going to leave it like that. We need that. Okay. So that's what it means, like the higher is built on the lower. And, of course, then the higher includes the lower. Again, if you say, well, I'm going to be a Buddha for the benefit of others, well, what if others, so you imagine the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, a lot of people are just coming up to him and saying, like, I'm having problems with my family, with my, husband or wife or children, what should I do? Does the Buddha go, well, that's all just worldly things. You don't need that. Shave your head and become a monk or a nun. He doesn't. I mean, sometimes he does, but that's not a standard answer, right? He's probably just giving all this really basic good advice for how to lead a happy life. So we can't have this attitude of just like, oh, that stuff's like below me. It might be something that you personally don't need right now, but if you really have that compassion, you need to know that too, right? It kind of makes sense. So the higher is built on the lower and the lower included within the higher. And then it's just the motivation really that give us these differences between, there shouldn't be 5 and 3 vehicles, like the 5 vehicles and the 3 basic motivations. And then he says, last of all, they return to the one great vehicle. So at the end, in this teaching at least, Venerable Inshun is saying, ultimately though, we need to head back to the great vehicle. So even though we might have these other goals, ultimately one needs to come back to the great vehicle. Now, this I think is a bit of a shift in some of Venerable Inshun's ideas. It's a bit more of an academic kind of discussion. But let's just leave it like that for now, shall we? This idea that at a certain part of our process we might have a certain motivation, but also don't forget, motivations can also change. That's the key thing. Be open to change in our own motivations, and also don't look down on others' motivations, or don't look up. Sometimes we do the reverse. We see others that have a higher motivation than us, and we get a bit kind of like, ew, you think you're so, high and mighty. A lot of times when people do that, and people do that a lot, don't think you're better than me. I mean, some people are arrogant, true, but sometimes we also have to watch it's not just our own kind of inferiority, that when people do have a higher motivation that we can't reach, rejoice in that motivation of theirs rather than assuming that people are being arrogant. And sometimes that just shows our own sort of lack of maturity. So again, use this to look at our own practice, not others. Okay, last but not least here, 不自于中下，亦不弃中下，缘色相佛成，不绑于正法。Do not become mired in the middling and lower, and do not abandon the middling and lower. Perfecting and including them move toward the Buddha vehicle, and do not slander the true Dharma. Okay, so what are our ideas here? Yeah, kind of a similar idea. You might start with a lower motivation. That's fine. That's fine. But don't just become stuck there. You know, you might work on it a while and then you might change your motivation, and that's fine. Hopefully you'll change your motivation for the higher rather than the lower. But always, you know, keep in mind this kind of flexibility. Don't be too rigid. But also if you seek a higher motivation, don't abandon the middling and lower either. You know, they're still a foundation for the higher ones. So let's say, and this is really what this text is trying to encourage us towards, this goal of the higher vehicle, the great vehicle, for the liberation of ourselves and others. We need to perfect and include all these other lower motivations. We need to perfect our refuge and our basic 5 precepts, and just our basic day-to-day practice: generosity, giving, sharing, being a good, decent human being, as well as developing our meditation, developing our wisdom, developing this great, immeasurable compassion, right? All of these things kind of build on each other. So, perfecting and including the lower, but slowly move towards that higher vehicle, and do not slander the true Dharma. Now, this last line is kind of a comment that kind of shows up in some Mahayana texts as like, what happened in India, at least, is when the Mahayana appeared. There were definitely some traditions that did not accept the Mahayana as sort of the true teachings of the Buddha, and they really like heavily criticized them. It's not true Buddhism. It's evil. It's bad. And he's sort of saying that even if you don't necessarily want to practice these higher goals yourselves, be careful about slandering others that do. And I think this is a good kind of a practice, like in general, even in a broader sense. Everyone, we're on our own little journey here. We kind of might have a similar journey to others at some points, and at other times we shift into other little stages of our journey. That's fine. But when we encounter teachings or other people on other practices that we don't get, like, I don't quite get that, that doesn't seem to work for me or whatever, that's fine. You can just say, like, this is not for me at this moment. But kind of tend to refrain from sort of like then just sort of slandering it and saying, oh, this is like evil or corrupt, this is not the true Dharma. Once we start to sort of like get into the flame wars of just like always being critical of others, it doesn't often help us much either. Sometimes we're just not at that point. It's just that teaching isn't ready for us at this time. That doesn't mean it's not for anyone at any time. So it's kind of like an openness to different possibilities, and always keep that in mind. I think particularly for the Mahayana. Mahayana is a very encompassing practice, an encompassing tradition. We even see in some Mahayana scriptures talking about bodhisattvas that take rebirth as religious teachers of other religions, so the bodhisattva can do that because they know at a certain time certain beings need that particular form to help them at that particular stage of their path. We should be really careful about criticizing another and saying, they're teaching some false way or some false practice. Who knows? They might just be operating on this totally higher level to us. They feel like their whole level is so far beyond us, we're just not seeing it. So let them worry about that. We're going to focus on our own practice, get ourselves together. When we've got ourselves together, we'll naturally be able to more able to guide and help others, those others that have a connection with us. And people that don't, no, don't worry. There are many more bodhisattvas and Buddhas out there to help guide them on the way as well. Okay, well, that wraps up today of talking about these 3 basic motivations: the lower motivation for happiness in this and future lives, middling motivation, which seeks to be liberated from cyclic existence, and the higher motivation, which seeks to become a fully awakened Buddha out of compassion for the benefit of others, and the corresponding 5 vehicles: the human vehicle, the divine vehicle, the arhat, liberated vehicle, the Prajika Buddha vehicle, and finally the Bodhisattva vehicle, which leads to full awakening. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll be back again next week, continuing on, and then we're going to get the next part we're getting into is the human and divine vehicle. That's the next section that we're going to jump into. So I hope you can join us then. I'd be happy to see you all. And in the meantime, have a great weekend. Catch you later. Bye bye.